This next speaker, I think you're going to find very interesting. I've had the pleasure of meeting David Cay Johnston. You've probably seen him on a lot of MSNBC and other shows. But David Cay Johnston was exposing America's growing inequality long before it became a topic of popular concern. He won a 2001 Pulitzer Prize in 2001 for his work exposing how the tax system favors the super rich and corporations, revealing how some companies literally turn a profit off their taxes and naming CEOs who built vast fortunes without paying taxes as much as 98% of their income. Imagine that, huh? Imagine that. Does any of you pay 2% of your income in taxes? You know? Mr. Johnston writes for Newsweek and is a columnist for several publications. Since leaving the New York Times in 2008, after 13 years as an investigative reporter covering taxes, he has taught the business, property, and tax laws of the ancient world at Syracuse University in law. He has written extensively on utility regulation for more than 4 decades. He is the editor of the new anthology Divided, The Pearls of Our Growing Inequality, and the author of 4 books, including his best-selling trilogy on how America's economy takes from the many to give to the rich. The father of 8 grown children. He lives in Rochester, New York. Let's give him a warm welcome to David Cay Johnston.
Well, good afternoon. I am thrilled to be here with you and to set my stopwatch so that you don't hear me longer than you're supposed to. You know, labor, after 40 years of being in retreat, especially in retreat after the election of Ronald Reagan, the only union president ever to get to the White House, is beginning actually to see things turn around by being innovative. Look at the incredible success of the $15 movement. And that movement needs to expand now, and I think the smartest place to go with that is getting rid of Herman Cain's law that forever the wages of restaurant workers will be $2.13 an hour plus tips. To change this country, you have an enormous opportunity right now. Polls show that 3 out of 4 Republicans want to increase Social Security benefits. 70% of them are willing to pay higher taxes for more Social Security benefits. Contrast that with what everyone in the clown car is saying about Social Security. We're at a point where 35 years after we made a terrible wrong move with the election of Mr. Reagan and his anti-union policies, people are asking the question that was first raised by Senator Mondale, Vice President Mondale in 1984. Where's the beef? If these policies of supply-side economics, of cutting taxes on the rich, worked, America would be awash with well-paid jobs today. Our biggest problem would be, where do we get workers? And job insecurity would, what's job insecurity? It would be like it was when I started out in the 1960s, that you never had to worry about finding a job. Well, the first step in this is understanding what's happening and educating people, so I hope that you will get out a pen or a pencil, because I'm going to give you some numbers that you really need to get across to people. When I was at the New York Times, I could get these on the front page. Now, you know, you've got to go to my column at Al Jazeera America or Newsweek to find these things, and I have a lot smaller audience. But you need to be telling not just your members, but everybody you know about these things. 2009 was the official end of the Great Recession. Under FDR, in the next 3 years from 1933, when the Great Depression officially ended, the incomes of the bottom 90% of Americans went up almost 10%, from 33 to 36. And the incomes of the super rich, the top 10th of 1%, fell a little bit. What's happened in this country now is, in fact, the opposite. From 2009 to 2012, Of all the increased income in America, from Miami to Seattle to Nome, Alaska to Hawaii, 10% went to less than 1,400 households. Less than 10% of all the increased income in America in the 3 years after the Great Recession went to less than 1,400 households. 21% went to 14,000 households. 62% of it went to the 1.36 million households at the top, the 1%. But you'll notice almost all of that went further up the chain of command. Now, there's a flaw in the numbers I just gave you. These numbers, which are official IRS data, exclude kids with trust funds and only count what are called primary taxpayers. We live in a country which Congress allows many people, very wealthy, prominent people, to live tax-free, as Michael mentioned in his introduction to me. I predict to you that you will never see Donald Trump's tax returns because a law that Congress passed in the early 90s, pushed heavily by Republicans, allows anyone who is a, quote, full-time real estate professional, which means, by the way, 15 hours a week, if they own enough real estate that the depreciation of their property is greater than their wages, salaries, dividends, capital gains, they can live tax-free. And I have Donald Trump's tax information for 3 years early in his career. He and I actually had lunch and talked about this, and he went negative on income taxes way back 35 years ago. In the same way, hedge fund managers and private equity managers like Mitt Romney, who was, I wonder how many of you know this, the sole owner of Bain Capital Management, the job-destroying Bain Capital Management. He didn't just run it, he owned it 100%. Congress allows hedge fund and private equity managers to live tax-free if they arrange their finances properly. What they do is borrow against their assets and they defer recognition for the tax system of their assets. Well, here's what that's done to America. From 1966 till now, the average income of the bottom 90% of Americans has gone absolutely nowhere. We are back down to the level of 1966 when you adjust for inflation. I was in high school in 1966. If you take the year 2011, because the numbers have gotten worse since then, the bottom 90% were ahead by $59 in 2011 compared to 45 years earlier in 1966. This is the official IRS data. Well, if you measure that as 1 inch, how did the top 1% do? Well, their graph, if we had a chart, would rise up above my head, through the ceiling, through the top of this building, 880 feet. But the real story is, how did the 1% of the 1% do? The oligarchs, the people who run the country. 1 inch for 90% of us, 5 miles. 5 miles. And if you go on the internet and look up my name and 1 inch, 5 miles, you can see a graphic and a whole explanation of this. We are creating a society with government rules that hardly anybody knows about, that I've spent the last 20 years prying from the record, that takes from the many to give to the few. Now, I've written a lot, as Michael pointed out, in the last year, particularly at Al Jazeera, about what's going on with our utilities. Wall Street is buying up utilities. It is manipulating the system. It has done its very best to create a system that rips off customers, produces enormous profits, and doesn't reinvest in the system. I have described Cheryl LaFleur, who was the acting chairwoman, as a sightless sheriff, assigned to go and determine why there is a house nearby where all sorts of men drive up in cars. And so she sits down in the living room, notices men going down the hallway with women in lingerie, and goes back and reports that nothing is going on. It's crucial, particularly for your union, that you get involved in making sure that state utility regulators and FERC regulators include people who are consumer advocates and labor advocates, and they don't all come from and go to that industry. Now, here's one of the worst things that's happened in terms of how we are running our government for the rich against everyone else. under a rule, a regulatory rule, not a law. I'm going to describe what's going on in the pipeline industry, the 175 oil pipelines. Like all other monopoly companies, they have to collect the income tax. And they have to collect what's called the grossed up income tax. So if the regulators say this company should get $1 billion profit, they have to give them not $1.35 billion, but $1.5 billion. Well, that's the cost of doing business, and we need to accept that that's the system we have and that's how it works, except for one little thing. In 1987, a law that Mr. Reagan signed the year before took effect, exempting pipeline companies that organize as master limited partnerships from the corporate income tax. Which means if you have a profit margin in that business of 10%, you're really getting 15%. Now, this system, by my calculation, rips off Americans for $3.3 billion a year. And here's the problem with fighting that. I'd like to get all of you to set up outside a table, and we'll sign a petition. I want everybody to donate $10, and we're going to go after this. But you should know that $3.3 billion a year is the equivalent of every single American being forced to reach into their pocket and give the pipeline companies 3 cents a day. It's a lot of money for the 175 pipelines that collect the money, but to you and me, it's not worth fighting over. But when you have 3 cents in this deal, and 5 cents in this one, and $1 over here in this industry, and something else in this one, pretty soon you begin to understand why people at the top are getting so incredibly rich, and everyone else is not doing well. We were told by George W. Bush that his tax cut plan would make us all better off. In fact, I called the campaign in October of 2000 because they were starting to say we're going into a recession, and said, you sure you don't want to hedge your bets for a year or two because things might get worse? Absolutely not. Enact the president's plan, the candidate's plan when he's elected, and everyone will be better off. So I said, fine, thank you, and the guy asked me when my story would run, and I said, on about 10 years. So I've run the numbers. For the 12 years the Bush tax cuts were fully in effect, Americans made $6.6 trillion less money than if we had maintained the economy of the year 2000, which was President Bush's standard. He said he would make us better off, no ifs, ands, or buts. How much money is $6.6 trillion? That's one of those meaningless numbers. Well, if it was evenly divided up, it would be enough money to pay all the income taxes and all the payroll taxes on it, to pay off every car loan in America, every credit card debt in America, and every student loan in America, and every household in America would have $18,000 cash in the bank. That's how much damage the Bush tax cuts did to us by just that measure. Secondly, we've created a system where the big multinational companies don't pay corporate income tax. Little businesses do, domestic businesses do, but if you're Apple or General Electric, when you hear a news account that says GE paid a 2% tax rate or Apple paid an 11% rate, no, they profit off the system because here's what Congress lets them do. If I take $1 out of my right pocket and I move it over here to my left pocket, nothing happens economically. But if I'm an American company with an account in the Cayman Islands or Ireland or Switzerland, when I take the $1 out of my American pocket and put it in my offshore pocket, it becomes untaxed profits. Then I go buy treasury bonds sold by the government because it didn't get that revenue. And you and I are taxed to pay the interest. So let's take a $1 billion transfer. Go forward 30 years at 4% interest. The company will now have over $3 billion. It will pay the tax, which is unchanged, $350 million. It's a zero interest loan. So they'll have almost $3 billion cash in their pocket. And we will have paid over $2 billion in interest to collect $350 million. This is a huge hidden system to take from the many and give to the few that is at the cornerstone of our problems. It helps explain why the median wage in this country, half make more, half make less, has been stuck, when you adjust for inflation, at the same level since 1998. It's just a bit over $500 a week. Half the workers in America make less than $28,000 a year. A third of them make less than $15,000, and their average pay is only $6,000 because most of them are part-time workers. Only 1 in 4 Americans makes $50,000 a year or more. Now, the Social Security Administration adds up every W-2 statement to the penny. And in 2013, the newest data we have, there are 60 categories of pay, from $1,000 to $5,000 up to $50,000 and above, 60 categories. 59 of those categories, the average pay fell. The only category that rose was jobs paying $50 million or more. We can address all of this by educating people, by getting people to know it. And as union members, here's one of the most powerful things you can do. When I checked into this hotel, the guy behind me, we got into a discussion about this conference, and I said, "Are you with the conference?" He said, "No, I'm an entrepreneur, I don't like unions." And I said, "Oh, well, you don't believe in market economics then?" And he said, "What?" And I said, "Well, a market is where you have a buyer and a seller who each are not constrained and have power to reach an agreement on a price. Individual worker going to a utility company has no bargaining power. He only has bargaining power if he has a union." And I'm sure you've all seen charts that show that as union membership in this country has gone down, incomes in America on average have gone down, wages have gone down in real terms. Economists divide the economy into two kinds of returns: returns to labor, returns to capital. Well, what the graphics show when you put them together is a big X. Labor going like this is its share, and corporate profits going like this. People need to know that. When someone comes to you and says, "Oh, you guys in the union, why do you have a pension? I don't have a pension," the right response to that is, well, you should have a pension. And if you had a union, you could get a pension. The reason you don't have a pension is because you don't have any market power. When people say, "Well, you have a secure job, you're in a union," well, you should have a secure job too. And if we had unions, which all of our competitors have, in Germany, executives belong to unions. In Japan, companies must have unions because that famous liberal labor leader, General Douglas MacArthur, for those of you who may be too young to know I'm being sarcastic, required Japan under the Constitution written by his staff to have unions because he said it would reduce the likelihood they would go to war again, it would create a more equal and prosperous society, and so he demanded the Japanese have unions to decentralize, democratize, and equalitize. We need to be, as a society, organizing not just members, but the whole society. And the moment for this is very ripe. People are recognizing that they are getting worse off. The average income of the bottom 90% of Americans from 2000 has fallen by a little more than $100 a week. No wonder people feel worse off. They see a bigger number on their paycheck because of inflation. But once you take inflation into account, their incomes have fallen by $100 a week. We have created tax holidays for big corporations. We did that in 2004, and we said, bring all this money offshore home, and just 85% of the tax we'll forgive because it'll create 660,000 jobs. Well, it didn't. It destroyed jobs. And the biggest single beneficiary, a third of the tax savings, went to one company, Pfizer, a company that every time it sells one of its little blue pills, takes the enormous profit it makes out of its New Jersey pocket and puts it in its tax-free Swiss pocket. And as soon as that law passed and Pfizer got an $11 billion tax break, they started firing 40,000 Pfizer workers. 40,000. We need to have a tax system which fits with our economy. We need to have a tax system in which the 2,500-year-old principle, a principle that launched democracy, the principle of progressive taxation, the more you make, the greater your tax burden. Because the only reason you could get rich was you lived in a civilized society, in this case Athens, that made it possible for you to get rich. We need to restore that principle. We need to make sure that we are investing in our country. We need to pay close attention to how we're allowing the degradation of our water systems and our electric systems. I live in Western New York. My electric utility is now owned by Iberdrola in Spain. We had a whole bunch of outages a couple of winters ago. What did these foreign buyers tell us about why this happened? Oh, they said, well, since there aren't many trees in northern Spain, we had no idea we had to trim trees or power lines would fall. Now, that's either an admission of incompetence, for which they shouldn't have been allowed to hold the company, or they were lying. But there's no good answer to that. And I'm sure many of your members have told you about all sorts of technical things that have been done that are degrading the quality of our transmission and distribution systems in order to jack more profit out of them. We've seen American Water Works, a monopoly, impose, through the help of regulators who include no consumer advocates, enormous price increases in New Jersey, and then tell the workers, we can't afford your health care plan. People need to be organized, but it's not just union members. And you don't want to tell people they're dumb or stupid. You want to say to them, you know, we used to have a better system in this country. We had a system where middle-class people were not desperately worried about whether they get a paycheck next week. A system where people could take out a 30-year mortgage and reasonably expect that they'd be able to pay it back over the next 30 years. A system where people were getting better off. And that's a system in which workers have some power to negotiate their pay, and they cannot do that without unions. That should be a driving motion. And when people come to you and say, you got this, well, you should have it too. How can we help you to do that? So I want to leave you with this important thought about where we're going. This country was founded to achieve 6 noble purposes. The first power we grant our Congress is the power to tax. The first American republic which failed had no power to tax, therefore it failed. And those 6 noble purposes: establish justice, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, with a capital W in welfare. We need to recognize that we didn't create this country to make the rich richer. We want people to prosper. We want people to be better off, but we want every American to be better off because government policy helps. I brought Michael a copy of my most recent book. It's an anthology I edited that Elizabeth Warren, President Obama, Joe Stiglitz, Paul Krugman, a lot of other people donated to Leo Gerard of the Steelworkers. And you should ask him next time you see him if he's read it. I'm going to recommend you put it in the place where you can read a chapter at a time, and that's on the toilet tank.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, David.